Greetings from NJIT. I'm Mike Small, Executive Director of the Alumni Relations Office, and welcome to our latest Highlander Chat. So I'm very pleased to welcome today Martin Hammer, class of 1980. He is the Principal Architect at Martin Hammer Architects. He is also the Co-Director of Building Without Borders. Martin, thanks so much for joining me today.
Hi, Michael. Thank you for having me.
It's my pleasure. So Martin, first question. How are you? How's the family?
Yeah, it's an important question for everyone these days. Thank you. I'm fine. My wife is fine. Both of us, fortunately, are able to work from home generally. But I will say that my wife, well, she's also fortunate. She was in India in the month of end of February, March, and into March, and needed to return home on a U.S. State Department evacuation flight, April 6th. So she was fortunate to come back safely, but it was a bit of an experience.
Well, Martin, I'm relieved to hear she made it home well. I can imagine how harrowing that is, probably for both of you. But I'm pleased you're back, you're home, you're healthy. That's great to hear. And of course, you're out in California, the sunny state. So that's always a good thing too.
Yes.
So Martin, speaking of you living in California, one of the things that I found most interesting right at the outset, you graduated from NJIT in 1980. And within the space of a couple of years, you said, I'm going to move out to California. I'm going to found my own architecture firm. I'm going to go full into this field that's of interest to you. Those are two pretty significant life events, one personal, one professional, and I'm sure there was a lot of blend over between both. What did you learn from taking that leap and that experience?
Well, before I say what I learned, I'll say a bit about what precipitated that decision. So up through my graduation from NJIT, I lived in New Jersey. That was my life experience. I grew up in Livingston, a suburb of Newark, and did my college studies at NJIT. And in fact, I was even about to take a job with a small architecture firm in my hometown. And a light bulb went off, and I said, well, before you do that, why don't you go see something else? And I had traveled after graduating from NJIT across the country. And in those travels, there were certain parts of the country that appealed to me, and one of them was Northern California. I really loved the area, the beauty of the area, the culture, the people, and I knew that California was more open to change and innovation than other parts of the country, and is actually a leader in innovation and change in the world to this day. It continues to be. So and coming out of NJIT, I saw there were lots of things that I wanted to do to make positive change, and that felt like a better environment for me. So I did move, and I went to the Bay Area, San Francisco Bay Area. I was fortunate to find a job in Berkeley with a small architecture firm, and enjoyed that. Learned quite a bit. But I was still struggling a bit with whether the East Coast or West Coast was the better place for me. Where did I belong? So I moved back to New Jersey, and I found a job with a professor that I had at NJIT, David Busing, who had a practice in White Plains, New York, and I worked there for about a year. Had a great experience there too. He was a great professor, a very good architect, and but that experience going back and forth, it made me realize that I felt more comfortable in Northern California, and that was just a better place for me, both personally and professionally. So I moved back, and was about to take a job with another small firm in Berkeley, and just before then, a friend asked if I would design and build a small addition for them, and I said, why not? Especially the build part, because it was something I wanted to do ever since my time at NJIT, was to get some hands-on building experience. It's one thing that I think is greatly lacking and often completely absent from architectural educations, is the hands-on experience. There's a tradition historically, centuries back, where architects were actually called master builders. Their design experience was highly informed by their building experience, and they were builders first. And it's something that is very valuable for any building designer, is to know how things are built, how they go together, to what works, what doesn't, what's costly, what's not, and to develop an appreciation for the people who ultimately will build your buildings, the contractors, the electricians, the carpenters, all the people that do the hands-on work to make your designs real. So that was very valuable experience for me. And that small project led to a second. A neighbor asked me to do something similar, so I did. That one led to another project, and another, and another, and here I am, some 37 years later, and that succession of projects never stopped. Mostly by referral, and or entirely, really, and so. Yeah, I've been very, very fortunate, and also, just to say, in terms of what all of that really points to in terms of lessons learned, is to follow your head and your heart. I feel like that's what I did. There's a little bit of risk involved, but if things don't work out, there are other things you can do, and if you can ultimately do what you are passionate about, what you really believe in, it's not even work, really. It's your life's work. It's more than just a job. It's your life's work, and so that's the biggest lesson learned.
I've got to say, I feel like that's a motto for NJIT students right now, starting to jump into their fields. Head, heart, do what you love, and you'll never work that day in your life. What I find interesting as well about what you did, when you pull this all together, you go out to California, you're finding a place that clearly, just suits what you're looking for professionally, personally. There was a lot of flexibility there. There was a lot of focus on sustainability in that area as well, which right early on, I think before it was on the national stage, certainly before we've taken it as seriously as we've taken it now. And the fact that you had hands-on for how to make that happen, it seems to me like you've got a bird's eye view right now of how sustainability takes place in the building and architectural field. Have you seen any trends of change from when you got started with your own hands on these projects and grew larger and larger to today?
Well, environmental issues were always important to me, even before I got to NJIT, and there was the very strong environmental movement coming out of the 60s and into the 70s, and so and definitely, yeah, California has been at the forefront of the environmental movement since its inception. So that was another thing that appealed to me about, especially Northern California. And when I was at NJIT, solar in architecture and even in the engineering realm, solar was really hot topic. A lot of people had interest in solar design, passive and active solar systems, and that continues to be important to me to this day. In fact, we have solar hot water system on the roof of our home, but things have changed definitely since the real beginnings. I'll say the real the beginnings of the environmental movement in the 60s and 70s. One thing that wasn't talked about at that time, or little or even no awareness of, is climate change. So Whereas in those days, and into the following decades, we talked a lot about energy efficiency in buildings and even embodied energy in building materials and systems. There was no talk of carbon footprints, what the carbon cost, so to speak, of buildings is. Whereas today, it's you could say it's the most important question in terms of the habitability of our planet. So over the last 10 years, especially, there's been a lot of discussion and movement towards reducing the embodied carbon and carbon footprint of buildings. Also, building materials and technology has changed over the years. So we did talk about energy efficiency at the time that I studied at NJIT, but the ability to make efficient buildings was nothing compared to what it is today in terms of building envelope technology or building for energy management systems that are very sophisticated, efficiency of lighting, another example that's made great strides over the last couple decades. So technological improvements and focus, right? I mentioned carbon, being concerned about carbon issues, which actually the carbon issue does play into some of the specific building technologies that I became involved with since the mid-90s. What are sometimes called natural building systems, and building systems that sequester carbon instead of putting more carbon into the atmosphere. And I could talk a little bit about that if you like.
Well, I definitely want to come back around to that. One of my guests in a previous Highlander chat was the former president of Exxon Middle East, and he has formed this company that does non-toxic oil shale reclamation. We got a really interesting conversation about the sort of sustainability that goes into something like that. But really, a huge part of that is carbon neutral, and trying to reclaim that carbon and put it away and so on and so forth. So I'd love to hear more about that. I will tell you one of the things that I also want to sort of lead as a throughput here, though, is you mentioned different types of building materials and more sustainability, and not just building materials, but the styles of buildings. And something that I was so fascinated by in your career is this sort of bale building material, where not only are you using certain types of materials, you actually set up some of the standards for bale building. I'd love to hear a little bit more about that. Where did you come up with the concept? How does that sort of lead in with the rest of what you do?
Well, so you're referring to what's generally known as straw bale construction, where baled straw, like the type we've all seen in in the field of farmers who grow wheat or other grain crops, are used as big fuzzy building blocks to make walls that are usually plastered on both sides. And it's a very simple, low-tech system that was invented in the late 1800s in the state of Nebraska, where there was a history of sod building, using sod and stacking it to make wall systems, because there was so little to build with on the plains, so little timber, and also very cold winters. So it came out of that tradition, but it was the invention of the baling machine in the late 1800s, where there was first rectangular blocks of straw that could be used, and it was just necessity, the mother of invention. There were these blocks of straw, cold winters, and the people in that region started stacking them and turning them into walls and building houses out of them. And it made a lot of sense then and in that place. The straw, it's basically an agricultural waste product or byproduct and it's highly insulating, which was a great advantage the cold Nebraska winters, and very inexpensive. It was local, and so that method of building was practiced for a few decades regionally, but then was essentially abandoned for then coming out of the World War II era. It just wasn't done at all. It wasn't practiced at all. There was no reason really, because there was a lot more transportation and access to building materials all over the country, and until that method of discussion or of construction was rediscovered in the 70s, really the 80s, when people started to notice it again and experiment with it again, and so it caught hold, especially in the American Southwest. But then from there, as people experimented with it and it just made it work again in a different time, where energy efficiency was important, and trying to use materials that were not toxic and had low embodied energy and were local. So it captured people's imaginations too, which was, for me, in a way, the most important thing about it. The first straw bale building I designed was in 1994. A contractor friend found out about this rediscovered system of building and asked me to design a building with him. We did. We built it, really a large building, a 3,000 square foot building. So we, I guess in a way, similar to the way that I just jumped into California, I jumped into straw bale building of, full force. And that was a transformational project for me, because it caused me to question why we build with the materials we do, and is it a matter of just convention, or it really opened up a whole palette of building materials that I hadn't previously considered, and to really ask critical questions about why we build the way we do. So from that, I designed and built other straw bale buildings, taught a class, local community college, and started to get into other associated low-tech building technologies, some of them that have been around for centuries. So, and earthen building, rammed earth. There's a whole spectrum of building systems using earth and straw, where on one end of the spectrum are straw bale buildings that are almost entirely straw, and the other end of the spectrum is rammed earth, which is entirely earth. And then in between, there's variations. There's adobe, which many people are aware of, especially the buildings in the American Southwest, beautiful and long-lasting buildings. There's straw clay. There's another material called cob, or monolithic adobe, which has been utilized for centuries, especially in parts of Europe and other parts of the world. And even in terms of durability, these buildings, when they're built right, designed and built right, they can last indefinitely. There are straw bale buildings which are over 100 years old, still being used. So they're very low embodied energy. They're very energy efficient. They're not right for every situation, but they're not generally such an urban material or system to use, but suburban even, and even with the straw bale buildings, with some ingenuity. There's a 7-story straw bale building in France, for example, a residential structure. The straw is not structural; it's only infill and used for insulation. But there are other prefab systems that are being developed in many parts of the world, and to give a kind of paint the broad picture of its applicability. There are now straw bale buildings in every state in the United States. There are thousands in California. There are four, at least four, in New Jersey. And I've visited them, and in some states don't have so many, but some have a lot, like I said, in California. And then there are buildings using this method of construction or some variation of it in over 50 countries throughout the world. So it does, in terms, I mentioned that it was a transformational project for me in my career, because not only did it get me into these other building systems, these natural building systems that have the advantages I described. It by, as a matter of course, caused me to get into building code development and building standards. At the time that I designed that building, there was a straw bale standard or guide. There were guidelines in the state of California, but they were not very well. They were a little bit out of date, because they were written based on earlier understanding on the building system. We learned more as we went. So I became involved with revising those guidelines in the state of California, and then from there started a new straw bale building code for the state of California, and that led to an effort with the national model codes that are used in the United States, what are called the I codes, or the international codes. And so with I led efforts to write and have approved 4 appendices in the International Residential Code, one on straw bale construction, one on light straw clay construction, one on cob or monolithic adobe construction, and one on tiny houses, which is another important subject in the building industry, especially over the last 5 or 10 years, is building small. So it's that work that I'm particularly proud of, that work, because it has a lot of effect. It has a lot of impact on the way, on the resources that are available for people to build in more sustainable ways, building small, building with systems that have very little environmental impact, and are energy efficient and are not toxic. So as my career has developed, I've become especially interested in choosing work that has the greatest impact. So including the code development work, I still do local work for clients. I've had great clients over the years and enjoy that work. But in terms of impact, it has relatively little impact. I'm helping a homeowner or a particular client, and so that's great. And I try to practice what I preach, and even in those designs, do things that are environmentally more as sustainable as possible. Done a lot of work with passive solar design, and make good decisions with materials choices. But definitely the building codes and standards work has more of an impact. And the other place that has had more impact, and a decision that I've made, is doing international work with sustainable rebuilding in mostly post-earthquake. And I think you wanted to ask me a little bit about that.
Yep, that's right. So, it's funny. I'm going to have you back on for another Highlander chat. I already wanted to recover the the carbon reclamation, the sequestration, and how you use that, whether that's a building material. I can't believe there's a 7-story tall bell structure in France. That's fascinating to me. I'd love to know what the bell structures are in New Jersey, because that would be so great for us to go and visit and talk a little bit more about. And also some of the other, as you said, the passive solar and so on. These are all things that I find interesting. I think our alums find interesting as well. I'd love to have you back on if you're interested in a couple weeks or months, and go more in depth about this, because this could easily take us all day. I don't want to do a disservice, however, to what you just mentioned, which is also, this is one part of your life. Clearly, it was the professional work, it's the knowledge that you've brought, it's the regulation or the rules and codes that you come up with, but you're also the co-director of Builders Without Borders, and so much of what I've seen you do beyond that personal and professional is also you going out to places that have been stricken by earthquakes, places that need that sort of reclamation help and that sort of sustainability help. And it's been amazing to me to see where you've gone. And I think largely at your own beck and call, you've gone out to do this proactively to help people. So I wonder if you could talk a little bit about that. And, there's some obvious examples like the work you did in Haiti, but there's other places you visited. I'd love to just hear what your experience was like, what drove you to do that, and maybe how other people could get involved as well.
My first trip to Haiti, well, after I had interest in Haiti before the earthquake, the 2010 earthquake. It was a very fascinating place to me, and it is to others. It has a very troubled history, really, and and there's a lot of poverty. There's a lot of political instability, and so it had interest for me before the earthquake. But when the earthquake hit, it was on everyone's mind. I think throughout the world, it was such a devastating earthquake that killed. The reported death toll is over 200,000, which is just a staggering number, and over a million homes destroyed. So it was so extreme that it was on many people's mind, and it increased my already high interest in the country and the people. Soon after it occurred, I had the opportunity to go as part of a reconnaissance team with the Earthquake Engineering Research Institute, which is headquartered in Oakland, California. And so I took that opportunity and went, and this was 7 weeks after the earthquake. I was able to document some of the damage. We're interested in why buildings failed, and so I did my part in that. And then soon after that, I had a second opportunity to go with a small team from the World Monument Fund to do historic preservation work, and I did that as well, documenting a particular type of building that had special architectural importance to the culture, and that was another great experience. Really immersing myself in these two visits in the culture and the place and in the devastation. I mean, it was Port-au-Prince, especially in and around the city, was just it's hard to describe. It was even people who had seen photos of it when they arrived in person were just staggered by the amount of damage. And but during the course of those visits, and even from the beginning, what I was most interested in was sustainable rebuilding. There's rebuilding after every natural disaster, and it's not always done well. It's done sometimes in ways that aren't safe. in ways that aren't particularly sustainable. And there's a lot of needed help from outside, and sometimes that well-intentioned help leads to sometimes failures, and and generally it's not optimal. So in terms of sustainability, but not only, there are cultural issues and misplaced efforts, and there's all kind. There are some successes too. There are things that are done really well, and you try to see, look at the efforts that were done well and succeeded, and follow their lead and learn from them. But anyway, I was especially interested in sustainability, but also culture, rebuilding that's culturally appropriate. So that was always the most, or at the forefront of my mind after the earthquake. And so after the other two efforts, the reconnaissance and the historic preservation work, I put a small team together to build a straw bale building in Haiti. I knew there was a lot of rice straw in the country. I knew of the poverty. I was trying to design and build an example of a building that technologically was something that they hadn't seen, they weren't aware of, although they had the materials to do it. But that was also in keeping with the culture in terms of its architectural design. So we built a small building in Haitian Creole, the Tikai Pai, which translates as small straw house. There's a tradition of the Tikai, the small house, rural house in Haiti. Beautiful buildings, but this was essentially using that architectural design, but with a new building system. So we did build a building there. That was my first rebuilding effort there, and I did some other contract design work for other organizations, and some building projects. But so anyway, it was during the course of my work in Haiti that I became co-director of Builders. Up until that time, I had known the founder of the organization for many years, and so we partnered with them, and then became co-director because I was spending so much time there doing work for the organization, for and with the organization. And that though led to there was some success there, but Haiti's a challenging place to work in. I love the place, the people, the culture. It's very hard. It's hard. It's hard enough for an American coming in to visit, but of course, it's so much harder for the common Haitian people. There's so much poverty and distress in the country. Mostly, I think it's around the cities. The rural areas are not quite so challenged in a way. They're challenged in different ways, but just as an example of the difficulties after the earthquake, in addition to this tremendous devastation that the earthquake brought to Haiti, by October of that year, of 2010, the earthquake occurred in January 2010. By October, it was discovered that cholera had been brought into the country. It hadn't existed in Haiti, or on that island that it shares with Dominican Republic. Up until that time, there was no cholera. There was malaria and dengue fever and other tropical diseases, but not cholera. And it was brought in from outside inadvertently, but there was other communicable disease, a health crisis in a country that certainly didn't need another crisis. So that was in October of 2010. Even though I had experience in Haiti and elsewhere, knowing what to eat and not eat, and water safety and hygiene, etc. I knew all the right things to do, but mistakes can still happen. And as it turned out, I contracted cholera in January of 2011. Well, not a pleasant experience, very difficult experience, miserable 36 hours, but I was fortunate in my position to have access to very quick medical care and treatment. It's a simple, relatively simple thing to treat with antibiotic, and had access to a cholera clinic. I was the first non-Haitian in this cholera clinic, and was able to recover quickly. But it's just it's important to understand that, or have what that experience showed me was how it's one thing to be fortunate like I was to have access to the treatment, but most Haitians don't. I was as an American in very good health. Many Haitians aren't. They struggle with nutritional issues and other health issues, so they have compromised health to begin with, and then so the combination of contracting that disease with compromised health and without access to proper treatment is literally deadly, or can be, certainly. So over 9,000 people have died since 2010, when cholera was first brought into Haiti. So it just highlighted for me that that disparity between people who have access to what's needed and people who don't.
So I think understanding the seriousness of what happened in Haiti and some of these other locations, I also have to stop and pause and just give you an enormous amount of credit, not just for doing what you're doing and pursuing the sort of building that you pursue for the purposes that you do, but for having endured a pretty serious hardship while you do it. And it certainly seems to me that in this time, people can really understand the sort of impact that must have. Um, if other people wanted to help out, and this is really just out of my curiosity, I know I get asked by alumni all the time. So they would go, to your website, or they would contact you. They'd say, hey, I want to try and do this. How would they pursue that specifically?
Well, the simple thing to do is to go to the website, Builders Without Borders, all written together.org. And there sometimes are ways to participate. It's a very small organization, really, that puts teams together to build sustainable shelter in places of need. And so it's unlike its cousin, I'll call it, in the medical world, Doctors Without Borders, which I believe was the first Without Borders organization. That organization is enormous and has worldwide presence in so many countries. Builders Without Borders is a very small organization. It has very little. There's no one who's a full-time paid person. And it's a lot of volunteer work. So we generally put teams of people together to do certain projects, or sometimes people come to Builders Without Borders with a project they want to do, and we find a way to make it work. So there are sometimes places and times where volunteers are needed on a particular project or for a particular task. And also funding support. We can always use that. That helps us do the work we do. But going to the website would be the the simplest way to at least, inquire.
Well, I have to say, just the mention of cholera is sort of an incredible thing in this day and age. That this happens, that it spreads, and I think you had mentioned to me even before we started doing the recording that cholera had basically been knocked out of Haiti, right? I mean, it really didn't exist there before.
Well, I'm not sure that it ever existed there. I don't think it just had never been brought in, and it had enough problems, enough
Yeah,
challenges to
right.
overcome without cholera. So, um, and yeah, but I also wanted to, maybe I chronologically didn't get this quite right, but before I went to Haiti, in 2006 and 2007, I was invited to go to Pakistan after the Kashmir earthquake there that occurred at the end of 2005, and I was invited to go with a woman engineer who's also from California to also introduce straw bale building to northern Pakistan, and it made a lot of sense for that region. So it was also a fascinating. Pakistan is also a fascinating place. Um, so that was the first time I did international work, but it was straw bale building that in a sense allowed me to go or caused me to go, and then and that led. And that was a fascinating experience in a completely different way, with the culture and yeah, I mean, yeah, it's just every place is different, and every culture is different. The people, but that was really satisfying work that we did, and so I helped found an organization there called Pakistan Straw Bale and Appropriate Building, um, that went on to build over 40 straw bale buildings in the community. Um,
Wow.
and we had hoped really expected it would be 400 or 4,000 or more. And we're still trying to understand why hasn't taken off as much as we hoped it would or expected, because the buildings they're about half as costly as concrete block buildings, which is that's the traditional rebuilding method. They insulate very well. They're non-toxic. They can be built very easily or they can be built with easily learned skills, um, and especially the fact that they're insulating, which in northern Pakistan that has severe winters, they, instead of living in well insulated buildings, they live in very poorly insulated buildings and build fires to keep themselves warm. So it's and there's a lot of indoor air pollution. So there are lots of reasons. It has lots of advantages, but we're still trying to understand and find ways to make it more appealing and have and be utilized more often. But it was the work in Pakistan, and then the work in Haiti, and then the third in sequence is after the 2015 earthquakes in Nepal, outside of Kathmandu. That I was looking at doing additional work in Haiti, and but then the Nepal earthquakes occurred, two of them 1 month apart, and that I decided to answer that call and introduce straw bale building again, and other methods of building, but all with the goal of introducing sustainable rebuilding. It's all about sustainability, and cost is a huge part of that. So it's environmentally sustainable, but also economically sustainable, and culturally sustainable. It has to be sustainable across the board in every way. It's not only about environmental sustainability.
Well, it almost sounds like those things go hand in hand. So if you're focused on one, then it starts to bring in the others, provided that you have a sensitivity to that at the start. And I've got to imagine that it's easy to focus and zero in on one piece and kind of forget about the other stuff. But it's all equally important to the people you're actually helping, I imagine, right?
Yes, absolutely. It's important to understand the whole picture and be sustainable in all ways. If you're sustainable only environmentally, but the building costs 5 times as much as a normal house, no one's going to build it. No one's going to use it.
Yeah.
So,
Straw bale or not. Yeah.
it doesn't matter what it is. So, yeah. So, and also, a different culture, a different place. But but and we had a proposal with the government, Nepal government, which is another issue, is to, in the same way of doing that I've been doing this work with the national model building codes to have greater impact. We're trying to have the approval of governmental authorities for these building types to allow to give them more greater chance of being utilized and being trusted.
So I'm gonna deviate just for a minute or two. I'm gonna kind of bring it back to way back in college, and we discussed some of these questions in advance. This is one of my favorite ones to ask. So when we were first corresponding about this, you mentioned two people who were really formative on your life and in your college career. And I had read a little bit about this in advance as well. They're two of my favorite people, Tony Schumann and Mel Simon, who are probably names recognizable to almost anybody who's going to watch this. Uh, what did they do? Have you stayed in touch? And if they were sitting in front of you right now, what would you say to them?
First, I would say thank you. And I have said that to them many times. I mean, they were influential in a very specific way. Well, and in other ways as well. Many of my professors at NJIT, I was very fortunate. I had great professors, and they all influenced me in positive ways. But relative to this international work that I've done, it was in the back of my mind ever since my days at NJIT. These messages that Tony Schumann and Mal Simon instilled in me, that I just I wouldn't have thought of without them, without their presence, without knowing what they had done. Tony Schumann I remember hearing about his studies and work in Africa, working with just understanding and appreciating the culture and the ways of building in developing countries in Africa, and up until that time, I don't know that. Well, when we studied architecture, it was about architecture in the U.S. or in Europe, or it was very Western, much more of a Western or a study of Western art, what I'll call Western architecture. And then, so here's a professor who's now talking about indigenous building methods and communities in Africa. And I just hadn't really thought of that. Is that something architects would even consider or value or look into or become involved with? So that just made an impression on me. And the other, which I carried through for decades. And then the other, as you mentioned, Mal Simon, who was my soccer coach. I was on the NJIT soccer team my years at NJIT, and Mal was the head coach, also the athletic director. But I loved Mal as our soccer coach. She really knew the game. We had great players, great teams there. And in the course of my interactions with Mal, I learned that he had volunteered in the Peace Corps earlier in his life, and had actually lived, I forget which country it was now, or countries, but it was not only Mal doing this, but he was there working for Peace Corps with his family, with his wife, and I think he had at least one child at the time. So that just made another impression on me. It was like, okay, here's my soccer coach who in previous years had done this great work in the Peace Corps, and so I carried that along with me as well for many years. So I think both those things together just helped me think that, well, I could do that too. I could do something like that. I don't have to simply take the more conventional path and do my architectural have an architectural career that is based only in the United States, or works only with more conventional ways of building. So yeah, but both of those, both Tony Schumann and Mal Simon, were of great influence in my life, in my both personal and professional life.
Well, Martin, that's wonderful to hear, and I think it's inspirational to me, and I know it's inspirational to a lot of alumni out there, and particularly, I might say, for this new graduating class of students who are going into a world that, frankly, none of us could have predicted, none of us might have expected. But I think they have an opportunity to look at a story like yours and seek to emulate the very best of what you've done, and I think you're paying it forward by virtue of what you've picked up throughout your life, and certainly at NJIT. So thank you so much for joining us today, really.
All right. Well, thank you, Michael, very much for having me.
Martin, it was a pleasure, and I look forward to having you back soon. I'm not kidding about that, because, man, have you done some fascinating things that I think we should hear more about.
All right.
So thanks again, and
Thank
my
you.
best to you and your family.
Likewise.
So again, this has been the Highlander Chat with Martin Hammer, class of 1980, principal at Martin Hammer Architects and co-director of Builders Without Borders. I'm Mike Small, and I'm executive director of Alumni Relations. Very pleased to have welcomed you here today. Please do stay tuned for future Highlander Chats as they come out. You can follow us online on Facebook, LinkedIn, and YouTube. We're also available as a podcast on Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, Spotify, and a variety of other podcasting platforms. Finally, my best wishes to you and your family for a safe and healthy summer at this point, and go Highlanders.